Good morning, Gertens gardeners. My name is Karen, and I am coming to you from the south end of our Gertens main building this morning, and we're going to talk a little bit about summer blooming bulbs. Now, it's not summer yet. In fact, it is still February here in Minnesota. We're solidly in the throes of old man winter. But if you want to grow summer blooming bulbs from scratch, that is buying them in a bag and starting them in your garden, you actually need to be thinking about your summer blooming bulbs right now. And why is that? So why do we need to be thinking about things that are blooming in the summer right in the middle of the winter? Well, with summer blooming bulbs, many of them are not hardy in Minnesota. That's where we live, right here in Zone 4. We have extremely severe winters. And a lot of our summer blooming bulbs hail from much, much warmer climates than we have here in Minnesota. So they like balmy summers and they like nice, mild winters, which we do not have. And that means that if we want to be buying these guys in the bulb form and we want to be starting them ourselves, we need to be starting them before our summer weather gets here so that they are ready to go in the garden when the soil is nice and warm and our temperatures are warm, and then they're ready for your summer blooms in June, July, and August. So we're going to be taking questions from the audience today, all about how to care for these guys, how to get them started, what we offer, and a little bit about how to. So I've got a pot here with potting soil ready. We're going to go through the potting process of potting up some dahlias here today so you guys can see, because it's almost March. Thank heavens we're on our way. And starting in the beginning of March is really when you want to get some of these summer blooming bulbs into pots and getting ready to go for your May and June garden. All right, let's start with our first question.
Yeah, so our first question is a little bit about the bulb itself. How do you tell which side is up and down?
Right, so let's talk about the different kinds of bulbs. So we have several summer blooming bulbs here. I've pulled out my dahlia rhizomes that we're going to pot up today. And we also have some gladiolas, which are actually corms. We have some caladium bulbs in there. You can kind of see them in the midst of they're kind of nestled in their peat moss in there. And then we have some elephant ears, which are another classic shade bulb for the garden. They're all kind of knobby and funky looking, kind of barky looking. And we have some cannas as well. And so some of these are true bulbs, some of them are tubers. And you can kind of see they come in bags with lots of peat moss to kind of absorb some of the moisture and to keep them happy and healthy in their little bags until they're ready to go home with you. And so how do you tell when you're looking at all these various structures which way is up and which way is down? It can be tricky depending on what you've got. So with a dahlia, usually when you buy your dahlia, you're going to have a big bunch of tubers. So you've got all these little fingers here that the dahlias have, and they grow these through the summer when they're in the ground. And then you dig them up in the autumn and they look like this. And you can actually tell most of the time what part of the dahlia is up because it still has a little bit of stem left from the summer growth last year. So in the case of most dahlias, if you look for the one thing that's hanging off the dahlia tuber that is a stem and not just a big long carrot-like root, that is your top. And the little tubers will always kind of hang down like little fingers pointing down this way, right? So your dahlia is always going to have the little fingers pointing down and your stem pointing up as if it was like the base of your arm, just like this. And that is how you can tell if your dahlia is facing up or down. Now with gladiolas, it can be a little bit harder because they're a corm, just like if we were looking at our crocus. We just planted our crocus in autumn. They look almost identical. They're like a big crocus. So with a corm, the donut side is your bottom. It looks like a donut with a little indentation in the middle, and then the little bit of a point where the stem is going to grow out, and there it is. You can see it right there. That's where the stem's going to grow. That's the top of the corm. So you plant it just like this, the top pointing up and the donut pointing down. With caladium, they can kind of clump up, and I'm sorry about the bags here, but you can kind of see with these guys, they're all kind of smushed together, and you can see that there's a little bit of stem pointing up in some of them, and then you can kind of actually already see last year's root, and the roots go kind of down into the side, so you want the roots pointing down. There's all the root. They look like little spaghettis. They're dried up, but they'll wake up and they'll get nice and healthy and happy.
It's
so you
hard
put
to see with the shiny package.
Sorry about that. So you can kind of see the root part comes down, And then with and I'll take the caladium out because this is a fairly easy bag to access. With caladium, or with, so this is elephant ears, this is colocasia. So we have two different kinds of elephant ears, you guys. You have colocasia, which is the one that most people grow in their garden. It's a shade lover. It can adapt to some sun, but it doesn't like the west. It doesn't like really hot afternoon sun. It can burn those giant leaves. But we also have alocasia here too. And alocasia is what you put in the sun. And they are very, very sun tolerant, but they like wet soil. So you got one that's shade for dry soil and one that's sunny for wet soil. And so this is colocasia for the shade, and you can see that it has like a little ring, like a little eye, and that's where the root will probably come out. We're hoping. And then all of these little rough spots, this is where you're going to be able to actually see the little nodules there, and you're going to get actual little like leaves and stems out of these little nodules on the sides. So it goes like this with the little eye facing down, and then all these little nodules can produce stems and leaves out of the bulb there. And we're getting a really, yeah, very, very cool. It doesn't look like much right now, but it'll be quite impressive here in just a few more weeks as it wakes up and begins to make leaves. So that's an elephant ear. And then we've got cannas, which are another beautiful tropical. And cannas kind of tell you. It's actually pretty easy to see. So you, just like with the dahlia, and my apologies for the bag, you can actually see there's the growth. It's already starting. It's like I want to be a canna really bad. I want to start right now. So you can see the growth right there. That's going to come out the side and then up, and you've got the roots already pointing down. That's stringy spaghetti. Stringy spaghetti goes down, and the little side growths are going to come up. And here's last year's stem right there. You can see it just like your arm. So stringy spaghetti down, arm up, and the little growths will take care of themselves. I promise they will straighten up as soon as you put them in the ground. They know which way to go. They'll figure it out. We give them not enough credit. Plants are pretty smart. They sense gravitational pulls. They grow up against that. So even if you kind of get it messed up a little bit, the plant will correct itself for the most part. So there is room for mistakes if you plant a bulb.
So another question that we got, you talked a little bit about soil types.
Yeah.
Do some bulbs like dry, wet? Can you talk a little more?
Yeah, so with soil, number one, when you're starting to pot up these bulbs, I always recommend using a potting soil. And I've got a bag of our Gertens potting soil here. It comes with mycorrhiza. So you can see this is our Green Loon, our Gertens brand potting soil here, which is a great potting soil for starting bulbs. Now, we talked a little bit in January about starting winter sowing seeds. And so with seedlings, you need a very fine mix because you've got tiny seeds with tiny roots. These guys are not tiny. They're quite big. They're quite chunky. They do not need those super fine mixes. And it's going to depend as far as soil moisture as to which bulb you're starting with and when. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to plant our Thomas Edison here. And we're going to talk a little bit about soil moisture and what to do with these various bulbs, because some like a lot of soil moisture and some only need a little bit at the start. So here I have a 2-gallon pot of, this is a 2-gallon nursery pot here, and I filled it with our Gertens brand soil, and you can see it kind of clumps up sometimes. And by the way, guys, potting is a messy process, and you'll get dirty. That's okay. Dirt is part of the process. With soil, that's just kind of how it is. So be prepared for a little mess. If mess bothers you, do this on a garbage bag or use some newspaper. I don't mind the mess. I love plants. I love soil. I love the smell of soil in the springtime. It's just my favorite smell. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to fill my pot up with soil. And then here's a very important part of your potting. You've got your little name label here. This is going to go in your pot, because once you guys have these potted up, especially if you're doing more than one variety, you are not going to remember when it comes to putting them in the garden what you planted in which pot. There's no, as much as you're like, oh, I'm going to remember that one. All the black pots look the same. All the little tiny dahlias look the same. You're not going to know. So you're going to, when we're done, we're going to put that little label in there so that we remember which plant we potted. And some folks will even go to the point where if they're just doing one pot, they'll actually tape their label from their bag onto the pot, And then there's definitely no chance that you're forgetting it, but this is not going to go in the garden, right? So you're not going to be able to transfer that label into the garden, but you can transfer your little label stick there. So we're going to fill our pot up. Now I'm going to take some of the soil out. Okay, so I'm going to make a mess. That's okay. Again, normalized mess. It's all right. That's just part of the gardening. We're going to make a little hole for our rhizomes in here. So you can see I kind of push the soil to the side. Now my soil mix has mycorrhizae in it, but if it did not, then I would be adding some of our flower green loon mycorrhizae in at the time of planting, because the mycorrhizae that's in the soil is going to bond to my roots and it's going to help create a more healthy root system for my bulbs. So if you buy a soil mix that doesn't have mycorrhizae in it, make sure you buy some of this, because this will go a long way to making a more healthy root system for your bulbs and for any plant that you're transplanting. Okay, so now I'm going to take my tubers, and you can see it's okay. That happens. It's all right. I have not panicked. It's just a little bit of extra energy for the plant. So if you break off a tuber or two, it's not the end of the world, I promise. This part up here is actually the important part. This is where all of your bud eyes are going to be. They're asleep right now, so you don't actually even see them, but they're in there, and that's where the plant is coming from. So this is a storage device. This is extra energy, but if you break one off, it's not the end of the world. And so I'm going to kind of dig down, and I'm going to nestle him in there like I'm putting a child to sleep, right? So he's just going to go right in there, and then I'm going to make room for the other one. Now, you can do one per, and probably our Dahlia Society friends are going, Karen, 1 dahlia tuber per pot, and they're right. You probably should just do 1 dahlia tuber per pot. But for the sake of the video, we're just going to put 2 in, and I would probably separate these guys out once I go to put them in the garden, right? But you can start them together, or you can just go with one right in the middle, in the middle of the pot, so it has lots of room. And we're going to take our soil. And again, see, this is not fancy. Like, there's nothing about this process that's like, wow, that's super fancy. No, there's no secret code to potting up plants. There's no need to like have a specialist do it, because you guys can do this. This is just, it's the same thing that you were doing as a child in the sandbox, right? You scoop the soil and you put it on there, and you cover up the bits that should be covered up, and you give it a nice little tamp. Okay, and that's it. 2 minutes later and we're done. So that is the process of potting up a dahlia tuber, and you can actually just see the teeny, right in there, the little circle, and I'm going to clear the soil so you can see it a little bit. There's the little circle of the branch. The dahlia tuber is probably about 2 to 3 inches into the soil, and if you can see kind of, it's obviously you guys can't touch the soil right now, but you can see from the color that this soil is lightly moist. So if I squeeze it, it does kind of stay together a little bit. My hand is obviously not dripping with water, right? But if I squeeze the soil, it is staying together nicely. But if I crumble it apart, it crumbles easily. It brushes off my hands easily. And that is the exact amount of moisture that you want with a dahlia tuber. Dahlia tubers are very sensitive to extra moisture in their soil when they're beginning, especially when they don't have active bud eyes on them. So you cannot get this too wet. I am not going to water this pot. The soil is just as wet as it needs to be until I see growth. So once I see little green babies coming out of here, once I see little leaves popping up at the surface, then I grab my watering can, or then I take this to the sink and then I water it. Okay, so absolutely no more water in the pot until you see leaves, or it will rot.
When can we expect to see some growth?
So with dahlias, it's anywhere between 3 to 5 weeks before you're likely to see the bud eyes actually start to develop leaves. And that can vary. So some of these dahlia tubers, when you buy them, if you see active rooting going on inside the bag, that means that the dahlias are already kind of waking up a little bit. And then you'll probably it'll take maybe 1 or 2 weeks and you'll begin to see those little leaves. But if you start with a dry dahlia tuber like this, where there is no, there's no little pink, there's no little green, there's like no active rooting, like all the roots are dry and kind of crispy looking, this is what I expect to see in a fully dormant, healthy dahlia. We're not going to expect to see any growth out of this little dude for about 3 to 5 weeks, okay? Which is another reason why we are starting these at the beginning of March. With active dahlia tubers, you can start them in April and they can be ready to go into the garden then in May when the soil is warm enough. But with a fully dormant dahlia tuber, you have to give it that extra time to actually start to wake up and grow, because it won't be ready to go into the soil now until we get to sometime in May when the soil temperatures are warm enough.
Do you have any tips of when to know to bring them outside?
Yeah, absolutely. So with all summer blooming bulbs that are non-hardy, and we'll talk very quickly about some hardy ones at the end, with all non-hardy blooming summer bulbs, we want to wait until the soil temperatures are warm enough that the plant can successfully continue to grow and not get set back by a cold shock to the system. And usually those soil temperatures that we're looking for are about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So in Minnesota on an average spring, and some springs are earlier and some are later, and get yourself a soil temperature probe. It's one of the best things you have. And side note, you can cheat a little bit. You can use if you've got like a digital meat thermometer that goes low, because it has to go down into like the 40s and 50s to actually accurately measure soil temperatures in Minnesota. But if you have one and you're willing to stick it in the garden and then wash it off when you go to put it in your steak, you can use that. But I do recommend using an actual soil temperature thermometer, because it will go low enough to actually measure those low temperatures. You want it to read about 55 degrees in the planting site, and we need to be past all of the snow, we need to be past all of the frost, because most of these are hardy to zone 7-8, which is like down in Louisiana. They don't really get a lot of snow and frost down there, so these plants do not want cold leaves. They don't want to be subjected to frost. We want to get past all of that nonsense before you put these guys in the ground. So past frost and air temperature, and soil temperatures have to be at 55. Generally those two things go together, right? We're not going to see soil temperatures in the mid-50s if we've got frost happening at night.
And then for planting them outdoors, is there a certain height or for the actual bulb, or is it more just the soil?
So when you have pre-potted your plants, you always want to keep the soil level where it was in the pot. So you're going to dig a big enough hole that this dahlia is going to rest where its base is in your garden. But move your mulch line away. So I am a big fan of, especially in Minnesota, we have hot summers. We can have a lot of drought. We had a lot of drought last year. Who knows what it's going to do this year? You got to have mulch in your gardens, guys. Mulch, mulch, mulch. So move your mulch layer away when you go to transplant your plants. And then you're going to dig a hole so that your dahlia stays at the same soil level in the garden as where it was in the pot. Okay. Now, siting, it's really important to remember how big your plant is going to get. So for like this little caladium here, he's going to be 18 inches tall. So that's a half a foot, you know, about as tall as this nursery pot is here. This is a front of the border plant here. Okay, so he's only going to get to about this high. That is a front of the border plant. You do not want to put him in the back of the bed, because the other plants will grow over him and you'll never see him. For a Thomas Edison dahlia, these guys can get, if they're happy and they're having a really good year and they're accessing the proper nutrition, they can get 3 to 5 feet tall, and that's more of a back of the border plant. So you're going to site them in the back of the border so that you can have plenty of access. He's not shading the other smaller plants, and you can see all those big, beautiful purple flowers that are like right here on the sign there, and they are that color. I've grown Thomas Edison before. This is one of the many historical bulbs we have here at Gerton's. Thomas Edison, this was one that was bred in 1929, so this was a kind of a Depression era, right at the beginning of the Depression era bulb. Gorgeous, gorgeous royal purple flowers. Love Thomas Edison. I've grown this many years in my garden. It's a great dahlia, and I'm going to put his little name right in his pot so I don't forget who he is when I go to plant him. So with glads, siting is a little bit different. So much like dahlias, they want to be in sunshine. Glads will take about 8 to 10 weeks to bloom from when you pot them. So you have a couple of options when you go with glads. First of all, I would be planting them in a 1 gallon versus a 2 gallon like I have in this. You can just see the difference in how big these little bulbs are versus a giant dahlia tuber, right? So like it's about almost a 3 to 4 for 1 as far as the total size of glads versus dahlias in most cases. So with the glads, I might put 3 of them in here, okay? So I might get myself a couple of 1-gallon pots. I'm going to put 3 cords right inside the pot. And I'm going to remember that it takes me 8 to 10 weeks for these guys once I plant them for them to actually flower. So if I'm potting them up in March, they're going to be flowering probably in June, which extends my glad season up, right? But there are some folks, cheers to our Dahlia Society friends, who are showing their dahlias in August. And they're like, there is no way in heck that a dahlia person who wants to show their dahlias in late August at the state fair is going to be starting their dahlias in March. In fact, they'll probably be holding onto their corms and starting them directly in the garden in May, because 10 weeks from May is right about mid-August, and they'll trim their flowers, they'll put them in the fridge and prepare them for the show. So you actually have a lot more options with gladiolas than you do with dahlias, because glads are fairly quick to flower and they only bloom for about 2 to 3 weeks. Dahlias take a long time to get going, but they will bloom through the whole summer until it gets too cold to bloom anymore. So they go for a lot longer.
Someone is asking, what about light? Do we need some sort of light for the bulbs or when they start to grow?
Right, so when you start your bulbs, you don't have to worry about light until you see growth breaking the soil surface. So you want to keep them warmer, you want to keep them at about room temperature. I wouldn't stick them down in the basement because it's too cold, and the whole purpose of this exercise for these semi-tropical bulbs is to get them somewhere warmer. Now, if you are going down the basement, that's your only spot, throw a heat mat underneath your, and we've got one right under here. We've got some seedling tray here. You can see my little heat mat. He's keeping the baby seeds, and we don't have baby seeds waking up yet, but there's the heat mat. It's keeping these seeds warm because it can get a little chilly in the greenhouse sometimes. So throw a heat mat in the basement underneath your bulbs to keep them nice and warm. And then once you begin to see little green poking up at the surface of your soil, you have to get these into light. So you can either use a T5 or a LED system such as what we have here. This is a strip light. This is a 2-foot strip light by Jumpstart. And you can put this right on top of your bulb. In fact, you can use a little setup just like this. And you can adjust these guys. It's really kind of cool. And you can just put him right here. So he's just sitting there. My baby glads are going to be in here. They're going to poke up. They're going to see their light right there. And I'm going to keep this on them for about 10 to 12 hours per day. I like to set my lights on my new, whether it's seedlings or whether it's young bulbs, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day until they're ready to go out into the garden, because by that point they'll be getting even more sunshine right when they go outside. So you can start with a strip light, or if you have a really great wide open, unobstructed, south-facing window, then you can go and you can put your pot in a south-facing window, but it has to have a lot of sun. It can't be obstructed by a tree or by your curtains, and then it has to be receiving that light. And we're just about to the spring equinox, thank goodness. So in another 20 days or so, we're going to be at 12 hours of daylight. I can hardly believe it. But if you've got a nice wide open south-facing or western-facing window where that plant is going to get that 12 hours of direct sun, that can be enough to keep them healthy. Make sure to rotate your pots every once in a while so that this side gets as much light as this side gets enough light, and then this side is getting enough light. Okay, so rotate your pots if you're going to put them in the window, because the light is coming from a direction. It is not coming directly down.
Another question is, would you ever start a bulb in water, or do you always recommend soil?
So here's the thing about hydroponics, and hydroponics is the practice of growing plants in water. It is a wonderful practice, and some plants, like cannas and like alocasia, not colocasia elefanirs, but alocasia elefanirs, do amazingly well in water. Cannas, in fact, we will be selling them in the spring as pond plants. So these guys can grow really, really well in water. And they're gorgeous. They're stunningly beautiful as pond plants. But if I take a canna that has been growing for a pond purpose, and we started it in water, okay, and then I stick it in the garden, we've got a problem. And the reason that we have a problem is that bulbs and a lot of different perennials and annuals grow a particular kind of root if they're started in a very wet or hydroponic system than they do if they're started in a soil system. Okay, so you have different roots for different kinds of of surroundings. So you have one kind of root that the plant can grow that is going to be saturated with water, and that can be very successful, like it can with our canna. So our canna growing in water is going to be super successful, but it's going to have a different kind of root cell growing than if I start that same exact canna bulb in a soil medium. So if you're going to plant your canna or your alocasia in the garden, I would highly recommend growing it and starting it in soil. If you're going to be putting it in your pond or keeping it remaining in a hydroponic system, then start it in water, because then you have started the plant successfully with the root system it needs to be adapted to the environment that it's going to live for its whole summer in, okay? If you take a canna and you remove it from the root system it was used to and you have to put it into a new one, it's going to kill all of those cells and it's going to start over, which kind of defeats the purpose of us starting these guys early. And it will kind of live off of the green growth that it's got, but it has to, you've hit the restart button. You might as well just have trimmed all the root system off to begin with. So you really want to make sure that you are starting your plants in the system that they're going to remain in for the gardening year. Now some plants will adapt really fast, so folks will grow, they'll start their little tomatoes hydroponically. Well, tomatoes actually, if you think about it, they grow really fast. So they can replace that root system very quickly. They turn that over really, really fast. With bulbs, they turn it over much slower. So we want to really be thoughtful about how we're starting our plants. Now, never start a dahlia tuber in water. These guys hate soil moisture, which is why I told you don't water this pot until you see green growth. If you were to stick this dahlia tuber into a hydroponic system, it would rot and die. It's just really hard. Dahlias are not adapted to wet soils. They don't want, they want to spend their rest period dry, and then they want to get growing, and then they want to receive their water. That's how they grew in their environment where they grew wild. So don't abuse that system. Work with the plant that you've got and know that, they have evolved to grow in that kind of soil condition, so don't try to force them into something different.
Karen on Facebook asks, come fall, can I keep the bulbs out in my garden over winter, or do I need to dig them up?
Oh, that's a really good question. Another Karen, so shout out to all my Karen friends out there. It depends on the summer blooming bulbs. So if you have planted some lilies, go ahead and put them and leave them in. You should never have to dig up a lily unless you are separating out a clump of lilies and putting a few more friends in different spots. However, with all of these summer blooming bulbs that we are starting early inside, we're starting them early inside because they do not like Minnesota temperatures, and they are not going to be successful staying in the soil over the winter. They are going to freeze and they are going to die. So no, you cannot leave your gladiola or your dahlia or your canna or your elephant ear in the soil over the winter. It will die, it will rot, and you will not have a plant in the spring. So come late summer, we'll talk a little bit about overwintering these guys and how to successfully pull them and store them for the winter. But essentially, once we have our first frost, you're going to see all of that beautiful foliage die back. We're going to take a garden fork, we're going to lift the tuber or the corm or the bulb out of the ground. We're going to let it dry on our counter, and then we're going to store it in a storage medium for the winter and start it over in the spring right now.
Awesome. And do you have any final things you want to talk about? Final tips or tricks?
Yeah, so a few things that you can do once you begin to see green growth on your bulbs. Root stimulator. You guys know I love my root stimulator. And bulbs are all about the root, right? So we're starting from a storage device that already has good nutrition in it, and we want to kick that bulb into gear. We want to get it going. So the second that you see little green guys popping up on the soil surface, go ahead and apply a little bit of root stimulator, and you will be amazed the difference it makes in how healthy your plant becomes over the year because you've grown that root system up. Don't forget your mycorrhizae. Again, if your soil doesn't already have mycorrhizae in it, make sure you're adding a little bit to your plant, because again, that mycorrhizae is going to bond to your bulb's root system. It's going to expand the root system out and allow that plant to make the most of the moisture and the nutrients that it has in existence. Make sure that when you go to transplant your bulbs, we are putting them with some fertilizer. Plants have to eat. They can't get all their food from the sunshine, which You can see it starting to come up. It's going to be a gorgeous sunny day. It's going to be cold, but it's going to be sunny. So plants get a lot of food from their chlorophyll in their leaves, but they have to get some food from the soil too. So use some bulb tone or use some Dutch bulb food when you go to put your plant into the garden. In fact, with the Espoma product, which is the bulb tone, you can just sprinkle that right in the pot, and as the plant gets bigger, it will begin to use that gentle nutrition you provided it and right into the pot, and then a little bit more when you go to plant it. Now, there are a couple of things that you want to think about, because a lot of times you will use some of these bulbs in containers, right? So people like to use, maybe they'll use, if they've got a really big pot, maybe they'll use a big elephant ear as like a big splash on the patio. Or maybe they'll use some cannas. Cannas make gorgeous container plants. So it's important to remember, if you're going to do container plants, know how big your plant gets. Because it's one thing to plant with a little 18-inch caladium, and some dahlias are very petite too. So sometimes you'll have a little tiny dahlia, and he's no bigger than 18 inches, and makes a fantastic container plant. In fact, I had a couple of red and yellow dahlias last year in my tropical container right by my front step. They were stunningly beautiful, but they only got this big. Now, Thomas Edison is a 5-foot tall dahlia. And he is not really meant to be living in a pot unless I'm using a really massive pot. So make sure that you're thoughtful about what types of plants you're choosing. If you're choosing bulbs, how big are they going to get? Are they going to take over your entire pot? Or are they going to be small enough where they can share room with the rest of the planting and actually make that container look balanced, okay?
Awesome. Do we want to do a quick walkthrough?
Yeah, so let's take a look at, we do have most of our bulb selection at Gerton's here already, so I'm excited to introduce you guys to our bulb section for 2022 here in the spring. So this is spring bulbs. And for those of you who are like, Karen, I'm not sure I understand the difference between like bulbs and rhizomes and corms, and you're using all these words, we have a wonderful informational The Garden Scoop, written by our very own Terry Knight here. And that talks all about all the different kinds of bulbs. We talk about spring flowering bulbs, autumn flowering bulbs, summer flowering bulbs, and you can kind of get the scoop on everything, because we have a lot of folks who come in, they're like, Karen, where are your tulip bulbs? Well, it is almost March. We don't sell tulip bulbs in March except for outside, already pre-potted. So you buy your tulips and your daffodils in the autumn. You buy your cannas and your glads and your dahlias in the springtime. So make sure that you understand when to buy the types of plants that you want to buy, and make sure you get in early for best selection. Here you can see a lot of our dahlia. We've got them organized by the different types of flowers. So we have different kinds of dahlias. We have dinner plate, which are the big ones. They have big, just like Thomas Edison I was planting, really big, like this side, 12 inches to 14 inches around, like a big plate. We have decorative dahlias, we have cactus dahlias, we have little ball dahlias. So we have all sorts of different shaped flowers of dahlias, and we have our beautiful gladiolas. And again, you know, space out your glads if you want a summer full of beauty. Make sure you're planting a few early, a few mid, a few late, or, you know, buy a couple different packages so you can plant them in waves so you get blooms in waves. We also have selections of our mixes and such on our carts here. So if you're like, I don't really know which ones I want, but I just want a whole bunch of colors, we have some pre-selected color groupings for you. So you can, it kind of takes the thought, you know, you can just let somebody have all of those colors. They all look gorgeous together. They're planned that way, so you don't have to worry if they're going to look nice in the garden together, if you've got the tones correct. And so there's so many options, you guys, for summer blooming bulbs. And I wanted to make a special mention really quick of our lilies. So we've got a selection of lilies over here. And these are true lilies. So this is the genus Lilium, and lilies are actually Minnesota hardy. So these guys, you're going to plant them once in the garden, then you're going to be done. You don't have to dig them up every spring, and you're going to be planting them pretty much as soon as the soil is workable. So that's probably in Minnesota going to be sometime in April. Basically what you want to do is you want to head outside to your garden bed. If the soil is unfrozen and you can stand on the soil without it squishing or feeling like a sponge where it's compressing under your feet, you are okay to plant your lily bulbs. And lilies, there's a lot of options. You can see all the different gorgeous colors. We have some that bloom in June. We have some that will go all the way till August. some that are like the Asiatics, which are pretty shade tolerant. We have some like the Orientals, which are super fragrant. We even have the Orienpet, the Oriental Trumpet blends, which can get super, super tall, up to 7 feet tall. So we have just about any kind of lily that you could possibly want. They're very, very easy bulbs. The only thing you will ever run into with a lily is that the rabbits like to eat them. So put a little bit of Repellex in at the time of planting to make them taste hot so that the bunnies don't want to eat them. And you will have summer-long beauty. I absolutely adore lilies. And I wanted to make special mention of the fact that they are available right now and will be available at Gerton's through most of the year. We have them potted up on the perennial lot, and then we'll have a few select varieties that do well planted in the autumn available again as bulbs. And come about September. Okay, well, I think that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys all learned a lot about summer blooming bulbs, and if you have any questions, feel free to throw those down in the feed. I will be circling back to the Facebook feed throughout the day to answer any questions that you might have. We so appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in 2022. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great one.